The thermal imaging drone circled 4,000 meters above the green zone of Helmand province, its multi-million-dollar sensors scanning every square meter of vegetation below. American operators sat in their air-conditioned command post, eyes glued to flickering screens that showed nothing but empty gray terrain. The high-value target had vanished into the dense riverside thicket like smoke, and the most advanced surveillance technology the Pentagon could deploy had gone completely blind. Somewhere in that tangle of trees and irrigation ditches, a Taliban commander responsible for 17 coalition deaths was moving freely, and every satellite, every drone, every electronic intercept system had lost him utterly. But one man wasn't looking at screens. Sergeant Tom Rackett of the New Zealand Special Air Service stood at the tree line with his rifle slung across his back, studying a patch of crushed grass that nobody else had noticed. He was 43 years old, gray showing at his temples, and he'd grown up hunting wild pigs in the Urewera ranges back home. While American officers argued over heat signatures and signal intelligence, Rackett was reading a story written in bent stems and disturbed earth that was clearer than any satellite photograph. The bent grass told him 3 men had passed through exactly 90 minutes earlier. The depth of the boot prints in the soft ground near the irrigation channel revealed they were carrying heavy loads, probably weapons and ammunition. A broken twig at shoulder height indicated the middleman was taller than average, and a smear of fresh mud on a rock showed they'd paused here to adjust their loads before moving deeper into the vegetation. Rackett said nothing, just gestured to his team and started walking into the green zone on foot, leaving the American command post and all its technology behind. This wasn't the war that CNN broadcast into living rooms across the Western world. This was the war that the New Zealand SAS fought in the mountains and valleys of Afghanistan, a war where cunning trumped computers, and where skills passed down from tracker ancestors in the South Pacific proved deadlier than thermal optics, costing more than a suburban house. The Kiwis had arrived in Afghanistan in 2001 with battered equipment, minimal fanfare, and a reputation for being so quiet that other special forces units sometimes forgot they were even in theater. What they lacked in flashy gear, they compensated for with an almost supernatural ability to find people who didn't want to be found. The Americans had coined a grudging nickname for them, the Ghosts of the Hindu Kush. These weren't the bulky, heavily armed door kickers of popular imagination. New Zealand operators moved light and fast, often carrying 60 to 80 kilograms of gear on their backs into terrain that made pack mules stumble. They could establish observation posts in mountain positions that coalition planners had marked as inaccessible, and sit there for a week without moving, eating cold rations and urinating into bottles, to avoid leaving any trace of their presence. When other units called for helicopter insertions, the Kiwis simply walked, often covering 40 kilometers through mountains in a single night march that would have crippled less conditioned soldiers. The Taliban learned to fear the silence. American units announced their presence with the thunder of helicopter rotors and the rumble of armored convoys. British forces brought overwhelming firepower and rigid tactical discipline. But the New Zealanders just appeared, as if materializing from the rocks themselves, often in places where the enemy had assumed they were completely safe. In one documented incident near Baghlan province, a Taliban planning cell had gathered in a remote village they believed was beyond coalition reach, only to discover at dawn that NZSAS operators had been watching them from a hide position just 200 meters away for the previous 72 hours. The subsequent strike was so precise that local civilians didn't even wake up. But this approach created tension. American officers, trained in the doctrine of technological superiority and overwhelming force, sometimes struggled to understand why the New Zealanders rejected perfectly good equipment in favor of methods that seemed antiquated. During one joint operation planning session in 2007, a U.S. Army colonel had insisted that thermal imaging was the only reliable way to track targets through dense vegetation. The Kiwi team leader, a laconic warrant officer from Whangarei, had responded by pointing out that thermal sensors couldn't tell you how many men had passed, whether they were injured or which direction they'd actually gone. The American had scoffed. 24 hours later, the New Zealand team returned with the target in custody, having tracked him for 18 kilometers through terrain the drones had declared empty. The secret wasn't mysterious. It was simply that New Zealand had never stopped teaching fieldcraft. While other nations invested billions in sensor technology and satellite networks, the NZSAS still sent its candidates into the bush with minimal equipment and told them to survive and navigate using skills that would have been familiar to soldiers in the Second World War. They learned to read weather from cloud formations, to navigate by stars when GPS failed, to identify every species of tree and plant in their training areas, because disturbed vegetation could reveal an enemy's passage hours later. This wasn't romantic nostalgia. It was ruthlessly practical. Electronics failed in the mountains. Batteries died in the cold. Satellites couldn't see through cloud cover, but the Earth always remembered who had walked across it. Tom Rackett and his team moved through the green zone like shadows, their progress silent despite the thick vegetation. Every 50 meters, Rackett would pause and study the ground, looking for the tiny indicators that marked his quarry's passage. A partial boot print in soft earth near a stream crossing. Broken spider webs between bushes that showed something man-sized had pushed through recently. Fresh scratches on a tree trunk where someone had steadied themselves while climbing over a fallen log. To the American drone operators 5 kilometers away, this terrain was blank. To Rackett, it was a detailed trail map pointing exactly where his target had gone. The Americans back at the forward operating base were growing impatient. Radio messages crackled with demands for updates and position reports. The intelligence officer wanted to redirect the drone to a new search area based on signals intercepts, but the New Zealand team leader politely declined, trusting his tracker's judgment over electronic data that was already 30 minutes old. In special operations, 30 minutes was an eternity. The target could have changed direction 3 times, set up an ambush, or simply gone to ground in a hide position that no thermal sensor would ever detect. 3 hours into the pursuit, Rackett found something that made him smile grimly. The trail split into 2 branches, a classic counter-tracking technique designed to confuse pursuers. Most units would have called in additional teams to cover both routes, splitting their strength and potentially losing the target entirely. Rackett studied both trails for less than 2 minutes before gesturing his team toward the left fork. His reasoning was simple. The right-hand trail showed slightly deeper footprints, suggesting men carrying heavier loads and moving more carefully. That was the decoy team, meant to draw attention. The left trail showed lighter impressions and a faster pace, the movement pattern of men who thought they were clear and were hurrying toward safety. This kind of deduction couldn't be programmed into a computer or detected from orbit. It required human judgment honed by thousands of hours in the field, the kind of experience that came from actually walking the ground rather than watching it on a screen. The New Zealand SAS had cultivated this approach deliberately, building on traditions that stretched back to the unit's formation in the 1960s and the legendary tracking skills of Maori warriors who had mastered the art of reading the bush centuries before European contact. Some of the older operators could still remember training exercises where Maori veterans would teach them to follow trails that seemed invisible to European eyes, reading disturbances in leaf litter and subtle changes in vegetation that revealed where someone had passed days earlier. The attitude drove some coalition partners to distraction. American units had standard operating procedures for everything, thick manuals that prescribed exactly how to approach every tactical situation. The New Zealanders seemed to make it up as they went along, adapting to terrain and circumstances with an improvisational flair that looked like chaos to outsiders, but was actually deeply informed by experience and training. When asked to explain their methods, Kiwi operators would often shrug and mutter something about common sense, a response that infuriated staff officers who wanted reproducible procedures they could teach to other units. But results spoke louder than doctrine. Throughout the Afghanistan campaign, NZSAS teams maintained a capture and kill ratio that exceeded most other coalition special forces units, despite operating with a fraction of the resources. They did this not through superior firepower or advanced technology, but through patience, fieldcraft, and an almost obsessive attention to detail. While other units planned operations around helicopter availability and fire support assets, the New Zealanders planned around the terrain itself, asking questions like which mountain passes would be in shadow at what time of day, where water sources would force the enemy to reveal themselves, and how the prevailing winds would affect sound propagation in the valleys. The physical demands were extraordinary. Afghanistan wasn't like the training ranges back in New Zealand, where the highest peaks barely scratched 3,000 meters. The Hindu Kush and the mountains of Kunar province soared to altitudes where the air had half the oxygen of sea level, where temperatures plunged below -20 at night and climbed above 40 during the day. Carrying combat loads at those elevations turned every patrol into an endurance trial that tested even the fittest soldiers. American units often relied on vehicle transport and helicopter insertion to avoid the worst of it. The New Zealanders just walked. On one operation in the Panjshir Valley, an NZSAS team spent 11 days establishing an observation post on a ridgeline at 3,800 meters. They climbed to the position on foot, each man carrying nearly 80 kilograms of equipment including food, water, ammunition, and observation gear. The climb took 14 hours through the night, moving slowly to avoid detection and to manage the altitude. Once in position, they remained almost completely motionless for the entire duration of the mission, observing enemy movement patterns in the valley below and calling in airstrikes with such precision that Taliban fighters began to believe the coalition had magic that let them see through mountains. The psychological impact of this approach was profound. Taliban commanders grew paranoid, assuming they were under constant observation even when coalition forces were nowhere nearby. Intercepted communications revealed fighters arguing about whether unseen New Zealand teams were watching their compounds, leading to operational paralysis as enemy units became afraid to move or communicate. This was information warfare fought not with cyber attacks or electronic jamming, but with the simple knowledge that somewhere out there, silent men with extraordinary patience might be watching and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The Kiwi philosophy of just get it done permeated everything. When equipment broke, which it frequently did in the harsh Afghan environment, New Zealand operators didn't wait for replacement parts or technical support. They fixed it themselves using whatever materials were available, earning them the admiring, if slightly bewildered nickname MacGyvers from their American colleagues. Weapons were maintained with obsessive care using improvised tools. Communications gear was kept running with creative applications of wire and tape that would have horrified factory technicians, but worked perfectly in the field. This wasn't crude improvisation. It was the famous number 8 wire mentality transplanted from New Zealand farms to Afghan battlefields. The cultural conviction that with enough ingenuity, any problem could be solved. Tom Rakit's team was closing in. The trail had become fresher, the signs of passage more recent, broken stems that hadn't yet wilted, footprints with sharp edges that hadn't been worn smooth by wind, the distinctive smell of cigarette smoke hanging in the still air beneath the trees. Rakit hand-signaled his team into tactical formation, weapons ready, but movements still silent. They were hunting now, not just tracking, and the next few minutes would determine whether months of intelligence work and days of pursuit would end in success or failure. The target and his bodyguards had taken shelter in a small compound surrounded by thick vegetation, probably believing they'd successfully evaded pursuit. The building was a traditional Afghan structure with mud walls and a flat roof, situated in a slight depression that would make it invisible to aerial observation. From above, it would look like just another abandoned farmhouse in an area full of them, but from ground level, Rakit could see fresh footprints leading to the entrance and wisps of smoke from a cooking fire inside. The enemy had stopped running and settled in to wait, assuming they were safe. The New Zealand team didn't rush. They established a perimeter around the compound, moving with excruciating slowness to avoid making any sound that might alert the occupants. Each operator found a position that offered cover and a clear field of fire, then simply waited. This was the part of special operations that never made it into movies or breathless magazine articles. The patient, silent waiting that might last minutes or hours. The willingness to remain completely still while muscles cramped and sweat dried and the sun moved across the sky. Some soldiers couldn't handle the tedium and would grow restless, making mistakes. New Zealand operators seemed to have endless reserves of patience, perhaps drawn from the same cultural wellspring that made their rugby teams so dangerous in the final minutes of close matches. The assault, when it came, was over in seconds. A precisely coordinated movement that put armed operators at every exit simultaneously, with shouts of commands and the crash of doors being breached. The Taliban fighters inside, caught completely off guard in what they'd thought was a safe haven, surrendered without firing a shot. The high-value target was secured, searched, and prepared for extraction, all while American helicopter pilots were still being briefed on the compound's location. The entire operation from initial tracking to final capture had taken less than 6 hours, and it had been accomplished entirely on foot without any support from the expensive technological systems that were supposed to make this kind of work easier. Back at the forward operating base, the American colonel who dismissed ground tracking as obsolete stared at the detained Taliban commander and struggled to find words. The man had evaded drone surveillance, satellite reconnaissance, and signals intelligence for 3 weeks. He'd been caught by 4 New Zealanders following bent grass and broken twigs. The intelligence windfall from his capture would disrupt Taliban operations across 2 provinces and lead to a dozen follow-on operations. And it had been accomplished using skills that British Army instructors had taught to New Zealand soldiers in the 1950s, passed down through generations of operators who believed that technology was useful, but fieldcraft was essential. This pattern repeated itself throughout the Afghanistan campaign. While headlines focused on American SEAL teams and Delta Force operations, the New Zealand SAS quietly racked up an impressive record of successful missions that relied more on cunning than firepower. They excelled at the unglamorous work that won wars: patient surveillance, precise intelligence gathering, and the unglamorous but vital task of finding people in remote terrain. Their success rate on manhunt operations was extraordinary, not because they had better equipment or more soldiers, but because they'd retained skills that other nations had allowed to atrophy in the rush to embrace technological solutions. The physical toll was brutal. Operations in the Afghan mountains aged soldiers faster than any other environment. The combination of extreme altitude, harsh climate, poor food, and constant stress wore down even the toughest individuals. New Zealand operators returning from rotations in Afghanistan looked years older than when they'd deployed, their faces lined and weathered, their bodies carrying injuries that would never fully heal. But they kept volunteering for additional tours, driven by the same stubborn determination that characterized their entire approach to the war. The brotherhood within the unit was legendary. This wasn't the manufactured camaraderie of corporate team-building exercises, but something forged in genuine hardship and danger. Every man knew that his teammates would risk their lives to bring him home, no matter what. This certainty wasn't based on speeches or unit mottos, but on demonstrated reality. In 2004, Corporal Willie Appiata had won the Victoria Cross, the highest award for valor in the Commonwealth, for carrying a wounded comrade across 70 meters of open ground while under heavy machine gun fire from 3 directions. The action had saved his teammate's life, but exposed Appiata to almost certain death. He'd done it anyway, because that was what you did. Your mates came home, or you died trying. That incident became foundational to NZSAS culture, a reminder that technology and tactics and superior training all meant nothing if you didn't have the moral courage to risk everything for the person next to you. American Special Forces had similar values, but they often came wrapped in dramatic language about honor and sacrifice and brotherhood in arms. The New Zealanders simply lived it, quietly and without fanfare, in a way that was deeply rooted in Maori concepts of wanao and the Pacific Island tradition of communal obligation that superseded individual welfare. The underdog mentality served them well. New Zealand had a standing military force smaller than many American divisions, and its defense budget was a rounding error compared to Pentagon spending. The entire NZSAS regiment could fit into a single dining hall, a tiny force by international standards. But this forced a culture of efficiency and excellence. There was no margin for incompetence or mediocrity. Every operator had to be capable of functioning at a level that would qualify them for senior positions in larger armies. The selection course for the NZSAS had a failure rate exceeding 90%, and the men who passed represented the absolute elite of an already highly professional military. This selectivity created teams with extraordinary trust and capability. When an NZSAS operator made a tactical decision in the field, his teammates trusted that judgment implicitly because they knew the standards he'd met and the training he'd completed. There was no second-guessing or committee decision-making. The man on the ground made the call, and everyone else backed him up. This decentralized command structure gave New Zealand teams remarkable flexibility and speed in reacting to changing situations, a crucial advantage in the chaotic environment of Afghanistan, where plans rarely survived first contact with the enemy. The contrast with more bureaucratic militaries was stark. American Special Operations Forces were undeniably skilled and brave, but they operated within a command structure that required multiple layers of approval for even routine decisions. A U.S. Army Special Forces team wanting to adjust their patrol route might need to request permission from battalion, brigade, and sometimes division headquarters, each level adding delay and reducing responsiveness. New Zealand teams operated with far more autonomy, trusted by their commanders to make sound decisions without constant oversight. This wasn't carelessness. It was confidence in the selection and training process that ensured every operator had the judgment to act independently. The political context mattered too. New Zealand's deployment to Afghanistan was controversial at home, with significant public opposition to involvement in what many saw as an American war. This meant that NZSAS operations were conducted under intense scrutiny, with every action potentially subject to parliamentary inquiry and media investigation. The unit couldn't afford mistakes or scandals. They had to be not just effective, but irreproachable, conducting operations with a level of precision and restraint that protected both enemy civilians and the unit's political viability. This added pressure actually enhanced performance, forcing a culture of careful planning and disciplined execution that other units sometimes lacked. The relationship with local Afghans was complex. Unlike larger coalition forces that often interacted with locals, primarily through interpreters and formal meetings, NZSAS operators spent extended periods living in remote areas and developed their own relationships with villagers and tribal leaders. Some operators learned basic Pashto and Dari, enough to communicate directly rather than relying entirely on interpreters. This personal contact provided intelligence that couldn't be gathered any other way, insights into tribal dynamics and local politics that helped the unit distinguish genuine threats from tribal disputes that looked like insurgent activity to outside observers. The tracking skills that had proven so valuable in manhunt operations also served them in force protection and route clearance. Taliban fighters frequently planted improvised explosive devices along routes used by coalition forces, and detecting these weapons before they detonated was a constant challenge. American units relied heavily on electronic countermeasures and armored vehicles designed to survive blasts. The New Zealanders added another layer. Operators trained to spot the subtle disturbances in soil and vegetation that indicated someone had recently dug up the road surface. This wasn't a replacement for technology, but a complement to it, providing an additional margin of safety that sometimes made the difference between a successful patrol and a mass casualty event. One particular skill set the Kiwis apart in the minds of their coalition partners. They could move through hostile territory almost invisibly, conducting reconnaissance missions that penetrated deep into areas nominally controlled by the Taliban. These operations required days, or sometimes weeks of careful movement, avoiding populated areas and enemy patrols while gathering information about weapons caches, command nodes, and infiltration routes. The intelligence gathered during these patrols informed larger coalition operations and helped disrupt enemy activity before it materialized into attacks on friendly forces. The mental strain of this work was enormous. Operators spent months at a time in small teams, isolated from support, and living under constant threat of discovery and attack. The stress of maintaining perfect noise and light discipline for days on end, of knowing that a single mistake could compromise the mission and get everyone killed, wore on even the most resilient individuals. Back home in New Zealand, NZSAS families learned to recognize the signs of operational stress, the hypervigilance, the inability to relax in crowds, the tendency to position oneself with back to walls and eyes on exits. The unit provided psychological support, but there was an unspoken culture of toughness that made some operators reluctant to admit they were struggling. As the war dragged into its second decade, the nature of operations evolved. Early deployments had focused on direct action missions, raids on Taliban compounds, ambushes of weapons convoys, and manhunts for high-value targets. Later rotations shifted toward training Afghan security forces and providing specialized support to coalition mentoring teams. This required different skills, patience in teaching rather than conducting operations, and the frustration of watching newly trained Afghan units make elementary mistakes that got their own soldiers killed. Some New Zealand operators found this transition difficult, preferring the clarity of combat operations to the ambiguous work of capacity building. But even in the training role, the Kiwi approach left its mark. Rather than teaching by the book, New Zealand instructors emphasized adaptability and initiative, trying to build Afghan units that could function independently rather than just follow prescribed procedures. This sometimes created tension with other coalition trainers who wanted standardized methods that could be easily assessed and measured. The New Zealanders argued that standardization was useless if it produced soldiers who couldn't think for themselves when plans fell apart, which they always did in Afghanistan. The toll on families back home was severe. New Zealand is a small country where military service often runs through multiple generations of the same family. NZSAS operators frequently deployed multiple times to Afghanistan, spending more time in combat zones than at home during the peak years of the conflict. Marriages crumbled under the strain of repeated separations and the changes that combat produced in returning soldiers. Children grew up with fathers who were frequently absent and emotionally distant when present, struggling to reconnect with family members who'd had to be self-sufficient during their deployments. The unit tried to support families, but resources were limited, and the demands of operational tempo took priority. Some wives formed informal support networks, finding solace in talking with the only other people who truly understood what it was like to send your husband into combat and wait for news. The military provided counseling services, but many families were reluctant to use them, concerned that seeking help might reflect poorly on their operator and affect his career progression. This stoic silence was very much in keeping with broader New Zealand culture, where complaining about hardship was seen as weakness. The legend of New Zealand tracking skills spread beyond coalition special operations. Conventional units started requesting Kiwi advisors for operations in difficult terrain, wanting someone who could read the ground in ways their own soldiers couldn't. This created an interesting dynamic where a handful of New Zealand operators might find themselves attached to American infantry battalions or British commando units, providing specialist expertise that enhanced the larger force's capabilities. These attachments were generally successful, though some operators found it frustrating to work within the more rigid command structures of conventional forces after the autonomy they enjoyed in the NZSAS. The equipment gap remained a source of both pride and occasional frustration. American Special Operations Forces had access to seemingly unlimited resources, the latest night vision devices, custom weapons, specialized vehicles, and support assets that New Zealand could never afford. Some Kiwi operators felt envy watching their allies deploy with gear they could only dream of having. But this scarcity also bred innovation and forced a focus on fundamental skills that didn't require expensive technology. In hindsight, many operators came to see the equipment limitations as a disguised advantage that had made them better soldiers. The war in Afghanistan would eventually wind down, though the departure of coalition forces left many questions unresolved and many sacrifices seemingly wasted. For the New Zealand SAS, the campaign represented both a validation of their approach and a sobering reminder of warfare's costs. They'd proven that old skills still mattered in modern combat, that human judgment could outperform expensive sensors, and that small teams with superior training could accomplish missions that seemed impossible on paper. But they'd also paid a price in lives disrupted, bodies broken, and minds scarred by experiences that would never fully heal. Tom Rackhead eventually returned home to New Zealand, his active service career ending after one final deployment. He struggled with civilian life, finding it difficult to adjust to a world where people worried about trivial problems and couldn't understand what he'd seen and done. The skills that had made him such an effective tracker in Afghanistan had limited application in peacetime New Zealand. But occasionally, he'd take his sons hunting in the Urewera ranges, teaching them to read the forest the way his father had taught him, passing down knowledge that stretched back through generations and had proven its worth in the mountains of the Hindu Kush.